The satisfying crack of palm against flesh echoed through the first-class cabin. Brenda Kroll felt the sting radiate through her hand as the pregnant woman violently stumbled backwards. 8 months pregnant, asking for a seat belt extender. That was her crime. Lena Corbett crumpled back into her seat, one hand clutching her burning chest, the other desperately cradling her belly. 12 passengers watched in frozen horror. Lena stood frozen in the aisle of Flight 602, her right hand cradled against her chest where flight attendant Brenda Kroll had just slapped it away. The sting radiated up her arm, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the shock spreading through her like ice water. She was 32 weeks pregnant, exhausted from a morning of travel, and now standing in front of 24 witnesses who'd just watched a uniformed authority figure strike her for the crime of asking for help. You don't decide safety protocols. You do. Brenda's voice came out clipped and cold, each word enunciated with the precision of someone who'd said similar things many times before and expected immediate compliance. Sit down before you hurt yourself or someone else. The threat wasn't subtle. Lena felt her face go hot, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back through sheer willpower. Crying would make this worse. Showing weakness would give this woman more ammunition. She'd learned that lesson growing up in North Omaha, learned it again working night shifts in the NICU where showing emotion to the wrong attending physician could get you labeled as too sensitive for critical care. I just needed the seatbelt extender. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, almost apologetic, and she hated herself a little for that. My doctor said I should request one. I have the note in my purse. Anybody can print a letter. Brenda's dismissal was casual, practiced, the tone of someone who'd perfected the art of plausible deniability. She wasn't shouting, wasn't using slurs, wasn't doing anything that would sound overtly abusive if reported later. She was just being efficient, just maintaining order, just doing her job the way she'd done it for 18 years with Prairie Skies Airlines. Lena's hand throbbed where Brenda had struck it. She looked down and saw the red outline of fingers already forming against her brown skin. Evidence that would fade in an hour but felt permanent in this moment. Around her, passengers had returned their attention to screens and books, the brief interruption already forgotten or deliberately ignored. The woman in 2C glanced up, made eye contact with Lena for half a second, then looked away with the guilty speed of someone who decided this wasn't their problem. Let me ask you a question. How many more Lena are out there right now, being harassed with no one watching? No one recording? No one believing them? If this story already has you hooked, please hit that like button, because engagement is what makes these stories reach people who need to see them. Subscribe because injustice doesn't stop when you close this video. Only one person was still watching. In seat 4B, a man in his 30s with a sales rep's polished appearance had his phone angled toward the aisle, screen glowing, red recording light visible if you knew where to look. Caleb Voss had started filming the moment he'd heard Brenda's voice rise, some instinct honed from 3 years of documenting corporate misconduct telling him this was going to matter later. Brenda noticed the phone and her expression shifted, annoyance giving way to something harder. Recording devices must be stowed during taxi and takeoff. Federal regulation. We're still at the gate. Caleb's response was mild but unyielding. And there's no regulation prohibiting passenger photography of the cabin environment. I checked before boarding. The two locked eyes in a contest of wills that had nothing to do with Lena and everything to do with who controlled the narrative of what had just happened. Brenda's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath her carefully applied makeup, but she was smart enough to recognize a battle she couldn't win without escalating into territory that would definitely be reportable. She turned back to Lena with forced patience. "The extender is right here." She pulled it from the pocket of her service vest and shoved it against Lena's sternum with enough force to make her stumble back a step. The satisfying crack of palm against flesh echoed through the first-class cabin. "Next time, try asking politely instead of creating a scene that disturbs other passengers." Lena stumbled back. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment Lena actually questioned her own memory of events. Had she created a scene? Had she been rude without realizing it? The doubt lasted only seconds before anger burned it away. But those seconds were enough to show her how this worked. How people in authority rewrote reality to position themselves as reasonable and their victims as problems. She took the extender without responding and made her way back to seat 3C. Her legs shaking with adrenaline and hormones, and the peculiar humiliation of being assaulted in public while everyone pretended it hadn't happened. The toddler in 2D was still crying. His mother trying frantically to sop up coffee with inadequate napkins, shooting apologetic looks at passengers who hadn't even been inconvenienced. As Lena lowered herself carefully into her seat, the baby inside her delivered a sharp kick to her ribs that felt almost like solidarity. She placed both hands on her belly and focused on breathing, on not crying, on not giving Brenda the satisfaction of visible distress. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Simone back in Savannah. "Flight landed yet? Can't wait to see you tomorrow for the shower." Lena stared at the message, at the casual excitement from someone who had no idea that the next 2 hours were going to fundamentally alter how she understood her own vulnerability in the world. She started to type a response, then deleted it, then tried again. "Still on the ground in Denver. Having some issues with the flight crew." The words felt inadequate, a massive understatement of what had just transpired. But she didn't have the emotional bandwidth to explain it properly via text. She hit send and watched the message turn blue. Proof it had reached her sister 1,000 miles away. Proof that somewhere outside this aircraft there were people who cared about her well-being. 6 hours earlier, Lena had stood in her kitchen in Omaha watching her husband Deshaun pack her toiletries into a carry-on bag with the meticulous care he brought to every task. He was an electrician by trade, someone who understood that details mattered, that cutting corners created hazards, that preparation prevented problems. He'd insisted on helping her pack even though she'd done it 100 times before, even though she was perfectly capable of remembering toothpaste and phone chargers. "You sure you don't want me to come with you?" His question came wrapped in concern he was trying to make sound casual. "I could move the Brighton job to next week. Tony owes me coverage." Lena had smiled and kissed his cheek, tasting the coffee he'd made too strong again. "It's a baby shower, babe. You'd be bored out of your mind watching Simone and her church friends argue about whether the nursery should be sage green or seafoam. Besides, we need the Brighton money if we're going to finish the nursery before this one decides to make an early appearance." She'd patted her belly, which had grown large enough in recent weeks that strangers felt entitled to comment on it in grocery stores and waiting rooms. 8 months pregnant meant existing in a state of permanent visibility. Her body transformed into public property that people touched without permission and made predictions about with disturbing confidence. Deshaun had wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands settling over hers on her stomach. "Just promise me you won't argue with airplane people. They scare me. All that power at 30,000 feet with no accountability. 35,000 feet for this route." Her correction had been automatic, the kind of useless precision she couldn't help. "And I promise to be docile and compliant and everything a good passenger should be." "That's not what I meant." He turned her to face him, his expression serious in a way that made her chest tighten. I mean, don't let them make you feel small. Don't accept disrespect just because they've got a uniform and you're tired. You're carrying our son. You deserve to be treated like you matter. The memory of that conversation played in Lena's head now as she sat in 3C with the seatbelt extender clutched in her lap and Brenda's handprint fading on her skin. She'd promised Deshawn she wouldn't shrink herself, wouldn't accept mistreatment quietly, but what were her options when speaking up had resulted in physical violence? When witnesses had seen what happened and chosen silence? The plane began to taxi, engines rumbling to life with that peculiar vibration that signaled the point of no return. Whatever happened from here would happen in the air, in that jurisdictional gray zone where flight attendants wielded authority backed by federal regulations and the implicit threat of diversion, detention, no-fly lists. Lena had seen news stories about passengers forcibly removed from aircraft, zip-tied, arrested, banned from airlines for perceived disruptions. She'd watched those videos with the detached judgment of someone who assumed the passengers must have done something to deserve such treatment. Now she understood how easily you could become one of those stories. How quickly a request for accommodation could be reframed as aggression. How thoroughly power could distort reality when no one was willing to challenge the distortion. Brenda moved through the cabin performing the pre-flight safety demonstration with mechanical efficiency. Her movements precise and her smile plastered on like a mask. When she reached Lena's row, that smile disappeared entirely, replaced by blank indifference as she verified the seatbelt was fastened without making eye contact. Arms and legs inside the armrests. The instruction came out flat, perfunctory, before Brenda moved on to the next row where her warmth returned like someone had flipped a switch. "Mr. Patterson, can I get you a pillow before we take off? I noticed you didn't have one." The contrast was so stark it felt deliberate. A performance designed to show Lena exactly how much better her experience could have been if only she'd been someone different. Someone worthy of consideration. Someone who fit Brenda's internal hierarchy of which passengers deserved care and which deserved management. Lena pulled her phone out and opened the Notes app, her fingers moving quickly before they could talk her out of it. Flight 602, Prairie Skies, January 14th. Denver to Savannah connection. Flight attendant Brenda Kroll, employee number on name tag, 4437. 11:23 a.m. Requested seatbelt extender. Was told I should have flown medical charter. 11:47 a.m. Extender shoved into my chest hard enough to make me step back. 11:47 a.m. Hand slapped when I reached for it. Witness in 4B was recording. The act of writing it down made it real in a way the experience itself hadn't yet. Made it something that existed outside her own memory. Something that could be verified and corroborated and used as evidence if this escalated further. Her mother had taught her that lesson during the police misconduct complaint they'd filed when Lena was 16 and a traffic stop had turned violent. Document everything. Timestamps matter. Names matter. Specifics defeat gaslighting. The plane lifted off with the stuttering climb that always made Lena's stomach drop. Gravity pulling at her body in ways that felt more pronounced with 30 extra pounds distributed around her midsection. The baby kicked again, a rolling movement that suggested he was as uncomfortable with the acceleration as she was. She placed her hand over the spot and murmured reassurance she didn't entirely believe. "It's okay, sweet boy. Just a couple hours and we'll be on the ground in Georgia. You'll get to meet Aunt Simone and all her loud friends. They'll spoil you before you're even born." Talking to yourself? The question came from the woman in 3B, who'd been absorbed in her tablet since boarding but was now looking at Lena with something between curiosity and concern. She was white, probably mid-50s, dressed in business casual that suggested corporate travel rather than vacation. Talking to him, Lena gestured to her belly. My doctor says it's good for development. Also, it keeps me from spiraling into anxiety about everything that could go wrong. The woman's expression softened. How far along? 32 weeks. Far enough that flying is getting uncomfortable, but not so far that airlines won't let me board. Another week and I'd need a doctor's clearance letter. I remember that stage. 3 kids. All of them determined to use my bladder as a trampoline during the 3rd trimester. She extended her hand across the empty middle seat. Catherine Reeves. Lena Corbett. The handshake was brief but warm. The kind of casual human connection that felt precious after the hostility she'd just experienced. Catherine's eyes dropped to Lena's hand, to the red marks that were now transitioning into faint bruises. What happened to your hand? The question was asked gently, without accusation, but Lena still felt her throat tighten with the urge to minimize, to explain it away, to avoid creating conflict with a stranger who might decide she was the problem rather than the victim. But Deshawn's voice echoed in her head, reminding her that accepting disrespect taught her son that some people didn't deserve dignity. The flight attendant hid it away when I was trying to take the seatbelt extender she just offered me. The words came out measured, factual, stripped of the emotion churning beneath them. Catherine's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Disbelief, then recognition, then something that looked like guilt. I saw that. I was reading, but I heard the commotion and looked up right as she made contact. I thought maybe I'd misunderstood what I was seeing, because surely a flight attendant wouldn't actually strike a passenger. She did. Lena's voice was quiet but certain. And then she blamed me for creating a disturbance that upset other passengers, as if I'd somehow forced her to hit me. That's not what happened. Catherine spoke with the firmness of someone contradicting an objective falsehood. You asked politely. She responded with hostility. When you reached for the extender, she struck your hand hard enough that I heard the impact from my seat. She paused, clearly wrestling with something internal. I should have said something, right then, in the moment, but I froze. I convinced myself it wasn't my business, that I'd misread the situation, that getting involved would just make things worse for everyone. The honesty in that admission did something to Lena's isolation, cracked it open enough to let in the possibility that she wasn't crazy, wasn't oversensitive, wasn't the problem. A witness who'd seen what happened and was willing to name it aloud mattered more than she'd realized it would. Thank you for telling me now. Lena's gratitude was genuine. Honestly, I was starting to wonder if I'd imagined how bad it was. She's so smooth with the gaslighting. Made it sound like I was being hysterical about a simple miscommunication. That's not new behavior. The voice came from the man across the aisle in 3A, an older gentleman with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. I fly this route monthly for work. I've seen her pull similar stunts with other passengers. Always people she thinks won't make a fuss. Always plausibly deniable if anyone questions her about it later. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Last month, she told an elderly woman with a walker that the chair needed to be gate-checked because it was too large for the cabin, even though it clearly met size requirements. Made the woman hobble onto the plane without it, then forgot to have it brought up at the jetway after landing. The woman had to wait 40 minutes at baggage claim while Brenda processed other passengers' complaints about their travel pillows. Lena felt anger rising in her chest, sharp and hot. Why didn't anyone report her? Same reason I didn't say anything when she hit you just now. Catherine's voice carried self-recrimination. Because reporting feels futile when the system protects its own. Because we tell ourselves it's not worth the hassle. Because deep down, we're relieved it's happening to someone else instead of us. And that relief makes us complicit. The plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign chimed off. Immediately, Brenda's voice came over the intercom with that artificially cheerful tone flight attendants used for announcements. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. I'll be coming through the cabin shortly with beverage service. Please note that due to weight distribution concerns, passengers are required to remain in their assigned seats unless using the lavatory. Thank you for your cooperation. The announcement was standard, innocuous, but Lena heard the subtext clearly. Stay in your seats. Don't move around. Don't cause problems. Obey the rules I'm establishing right now with the full weight of Federal Aviation Authority behind them. Catherine must have heard it too because she made a small sound of disgust. Weight distribution concerns on a half-empty flight. That's a new one. She's establishing control. The observation came from Caleb in 4B, who'd been quietly listening to their conversation. Making sure everyone understands she's the authority here, and any deviation from her rules will be treated as a safety violation. He held up his phone. I've got about 90 seconds of footage starting from when she grabbed the extender through when she struck your hand. I'm Caleb Voss, sales rep from Tulsa. I document everything because my company's been through 3 discrimination lawsuits in the past 2 years, and I've learned that video evidence is the only thing that cuts through corporate denial. Lena stared at him, processing the implications. You recorded her hitting me? I recorded her entire interaction with you from the moment her voice got sharp. I've seen this pattern before. Someone in authority decides a person doesn't deserve basic courtesy, then escalates when that person has the audacity to expect fair treatment. His expression was serious, professional. If you want to file a complaint, I'll submit this footage as supporting evidence. If you'd rather not get involved in a protracted battle with the airline, I'll delete it. Your choice entirely. The offer hung in the air between them, a decision point that would determine whether this incident remained a private humiliation or became something larger. Lena's first instinct was to say delete it, to avoid the hassle and attention and potential retaliation that came with formally accusing someone of misconduct. She was tired. She was pregnant. She just wanted to get to Savannah, celebrate her sister's impending motherhood, and return home without this becoming a defining experience of her 3rd trimester. But then she thought about the elderly woman with the walker, about all the other passengers Brenda had mistreated with impunity because no one challenged her, about the implicit lesson she'd be teaching her unborn son if she accepted violence and called it peace. Keep the video. The words came out stronger than she felt. I'm going to file a complaint. I'm going to document everything that happens for the rest of this flight. And I'm going to make sure Prairie Skies knows exactly what kind of person they've got representing their brand at 35,000 feet. Caleb nodded with what looked like respect. I'll email you the footage when we land. What's your address? Lena rattled off her email and watched him type it into his contacts. The simple act of having evidence, of knowing there was objective proof of what had transpired, shifted something fundamental in her sense of agency. This wasn't just her word against Brenda's anymore. This was documented reality that couldn't be gaslit away. Brenda appeared at the front of the cabin pushing the beverage cart, her movements efficient and her smile back in place. She worked her way down the aisle with practiced charm, asking passengers about their drink preferences, making small talk about connections and weather, playing the role of attentive service professional with skill honed over 18 years. When she reached row 1, She handed a bottle of water to the businessman in 1A without being asked. "Mr. Patterson, I remember you prefer still water, no ice. Am I right? You have an excellent memory." His response was warm, appreciative, exactly the kind of positive reinforcement that validated Brenda's performance of selective service. She continued through row 2, offering juice and coffee and soda with equal cheerfulness, her body language open and accommodating. But when she reached row 3, her demeanor transformed. She stopped the cart directly beside Lena's seat and stood there in silence, not making eye contact, not offering options, just waiting with the aggressive patience of someone proving a point. Lena looked up at her. "May I have water, please? We're running low on bottled water due to catering shortages." Brenda's response was flat, stripped of the warmth she'd shown every other passenger. "I can offer you tap water in a cup. That's fine." Lena kept her voice level, refusing to give Brenda the reaction she was clearly fishing for. Brenda filled a small plastic cup from the galley tap, the kind of cup designed for taking pills rather than satisfying thirst, and set it on Lena's tray table with enough force that water sloshed over the rim. "Anything else? Could I also get some crackers or pretzels?" Lena's request was simple, reasonable, the kind of thing she'd watched Brenda cheerfully provide to the passengers in rows 1 and 2 without being asked. "My blood sugar drops if I don't snack regularly." Brenda's eyes flicked to Lena's belly with an expression that managed to convey judgment without saying a word. "We only stock snacks for purchase on this route. $3 for a snack box, cash or card. Do you know that this happens every single day? To people who don't have captains who intervene, lawyers who document, or viral videos that force accountability. Right now, you have a choice. Don't just scroll past and let this be just another story you consumed and forgot. You can act. Like this video if you believe power without accountability is tyranny. Subscribe because these stories need platforms that amplify truth over comfort." Catherine made a noise of protest from 3B. "You just gave free pretzels to the man in 2C. I watched you hand him 2 bags without charging him. Complimentary snacks are provided to our premium members." Brenda's lie was delivered with such confidence that it almost sounded plausible. "Are you enrolled in our Sky Rewards program?" "I am." Lena pulled up the app on her phone, showing her membership number and status level clearly displayed. "Gold tier. I've been a member for 4 years." The evidence sat there between them, irrefutable proof that Brenda's excuse was fabricated. For a long moment, neither woman spoke, and Lena could see the calculation happening behind Brenda's eyes. Admit she was wrong and provide the snack, or double down on the denial and risk the situation escalating further with multiple witnesses watching.
Brenda shows escalation.
The system shows your membership as inactive. You'll need to resolve that with customer service after we land. My app shows active status. Right here. Lena turned the phone screen toward Brenda, but the flight attendant didn't even glance at it. "I'm sorry, but I can only go by what our onboard system tells me. If there's a discrepancy, you'll need to take that up with the membership desk." She pulled a snack box from the cart, the kind with crackers and cheese and a small cookie. $3. The petty cruelty of it was almost impressive in its thoroughness. Brenda wasn't just denying service. She was forcing Lena to either pay for something other passengers received free or go without, making a spectacle of unequal treatment while maintaining the fiction that she was simply following policy. It was discrimination performed with bureaucratic precision, each action defensible in isolation but damning in pattern. Lena pulled $3 from her wallet and handed them over, refusing to let her hand shake with the anger coursing through her. Brenda took the money without providing change from what Lena could see was clearly a register with bills and coins, then moved on to Catherine without offering her anything at all, as if punishing her for speaking up earlier. "Excuse me." Catherine's voice carried the sharp edge of someone done with politeness. "I'd like a ginger ale and pretzels." "Of course." Brenda's warmth returned instantly, poured over Catherine like honey, as if the hostility from seconds earlier had never existed. "Would you like ice with that?" The whiplash of watching Brenda transform from cold to cordial in the span of a single passenger was disorienting. It proved what Lena had suspected from the beginning. This wasn't about policy or protocol or safety regulations. This was personal. This was targeted. This was a woman wielding the authority of her position to punish someone she decided didn't deserve basic dignity. Caleb leaned across the aisle, his voice low. "She just charged you for something she's giving everyone else free. That's textbook discriminatory service. I'm adding it to the documentation. She'll say it's a computer error." Lena opened the overpriced snack box with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to stay calm. "She'll say the system flagged my account incorrectly, and she was just following what the screen told her." Plausible deniability built into every interaction. "Except I've been watching her serve this entire section." The silver-haired man from 3A spoke up again. "She didn't check anyone's membership status. She didn't consult any screen. She made a deliberate choice to treat you differently. And she did it knowing full well what she was doing." He extended his hand across the aisle. "Howard Chun, civil engineer from Sacramento. I fly 200,000 miles a year, and I've seen enough airline discrimination to recognize it instantly. What she's doing to you is illegal under the Air Carrier Access Act. Pregnancy is a protected status. She can't deny you accommodation or equal service based on your condition." Lena shook his hand, grateful for allies materializing from seats she'd thought were filled with indifferent strangers. "I didn't know pregnancy was specifically protected. Most people don't, which is why flight attendants like her get away with it." Howard's voice carried the weight of someone who'd researched this extensively. "The regulations require airlines to provide seatbelt extenders without charge, to permit frequent bathroom access regardless of seatbelt signs, and to make reasonable accommodations for medical needs including nutrition requirements for gestational diabetes or other conditions." "I don't have gestational diabetes." Lena felt compelled to clarify. "I just get lightheaded if I don't eat regularly." "Doesn't matter. Pregnancy itself qualifies as a condition requiring accommodation. The fact that she denied you free snacks while providing them to other passengers, then forced you to pay when you could prove your membership status, that's discrimination with a paper trail." Brenda finished the beverage service and returned to the front galley, her performance of attentive service complete for everyone except the woman in 3C. Lena watched her disappear behind the curtain separating first class from economy and felt something shift in her chest. Not quite courage, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that staying silent wasn't actually safer, it was just more comfortable for everyone except her. She pulled out her phone again and added to her documentation. 12:14 p.m. Denied bottled water. Given tap water in small cup while other passengers received bottles. 12:15 p.m. Requested complimentary snacks. Was told I had to purchase despite active gold membership. 12:16 p.m. Forced to pay $3 for snack box that other passengers received free. 12:17 p.m. Brenda claimed system showed my membership inactive despite app showing active status. Witnesses: Catherine Reeves 3B, Caleb Voss 4B, Howard Chun 3A. The list was growing, Each entry a piece of evidence that individually might seem trivial but collectively painted a picture of systematic mistreatment. Lena's journalism professor in college had taught her that documentation was power, that specificity defeated vagueness, that timestamps and names transformed anecdotes into admissible facts. The baby kicked hard enough to make her wince, a rolling movement that felt like he was doing somersaults against her ribcage. She pressed her hand to the spot and felt him push back. A bizarre conversation conducted through layers of skin and muscle and amniotic fluid. "I know, buddy. I don't like this either. But we're going to get through it, and then we're going to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." The seatbelt sign chimed on with a sharp ding that made several passengers look up from their screens and magazines. Brenda's voice followed immediately over the intercom, crisp and authoritative in a way that suggested she enjoyed making announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has illuminated the seatbelt sign due to reports of moderate turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats immediately and remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the sign is turned off. This includes all lavatory visits. I repeat, the lavatories are now closed until further notice." Lena's bladder chose that exact moment to remind her that pregnancy at 32 weeks meant needing to use the bathroom approximately every 45 minutes regardless of airline policy. She'd last gone during the layover in Denver, which had been nearly an hour ago. The sensation wasn't urgent yet, but it would be soon, and the idea of being trapped in her seat for an indeterminate amount of time while turbulence bounced the plane around made anxiety spike in her chest. She raised her hand to get Brenda's attention as the flight attendant moved through the cabin checking seatbelts. "Excuse me, I need to use the restroom before we hit the turbulence. It'll just take a minute." Brenda didn't even pause in her progression down the aisle. "The seatbelt sign is on. Federal regulations require all passengers to remain seated. I understand, but I'm pregnant and I really need to go. The regulations have exceptions for medical necessity." Lena tried to keep her tone respectful, non-confrontational, the voice of someone making a reasonable request rather than demanding special treatment. "If it was truly a medical emergency, you should have used the facilities before boarding." Brenda's response came without turning around, delivered to the passengers in row 4 as if Lena hadn't spoken. "Everyone needs to plan ahead and manage their personal needs appropriately." Catherine spoke up from 3B, her voice sharp with disbelief. "She's 8 months pregnant. Frequent urination isn't poor planning, it's biology. Surely you can make an exception for the 30 seconds it would take her to use the lavatory." Brenda turned then, fixing Catherine with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern for your fellow passenger, but safety regulations exist for everyone's protection. If I allow one person to violate the seatbelt requirement, it sets a precedent that undermines the captain's authority and puts the entire aircraft at risk." The logic was superficially sound, wrapped in the language of safety and consistency, but Howard Chun wasn't buying it. "I've been flying for 30 years and I've seen pregnant women permitted bathroom access during seatbelt sign periods countless times. It's standard accommodation under DOT guidelines. You're not being asked to violate policy, you're being asked to apply the policy as written. Are you a Prairie Skies employee?" Brenda's question was pointed, designed to undermine his credibility. "No, but I am familiar with Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 382, which explicitly addresses disability and pregnancy accommodations in air travel." Howard pulled out his own phone, scrolling to a saved document. Section 382.91 states that carriers must permit passengers with disabilities, including pregnancy-related conditions, to use aircraft lavatories when medically necessary regardless of seatbelt sign status. Brenda's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle jumping beneath her carefully applied foundation. "I'll need to confirm that with the captain." "Please do." Howard's voice carried the calm of someone who knew he was right and had receipts to prove it. Brenda disappeared into the cockpit, the door closing behind her with a definitive click. In her absence, the cabin filled with the kind of tense silence that precedes confrontation. Lena felt her face burning with humiliation, with the awareness that her bladder had become a subject of public debate, with the familiar shame of being a body that required accommodation in a world designed for bodies that didn't.
I'm sorry.
Catherine's voice was gentle. "You shouldn't have to argue for basic human dignity. This is absurd. It's strategic." Caleb had his phone out again, recording the empty aisle where Brenda had been standing. "She's creating a situation where Lena either violates a direct order from crew and risks being labeled as a disruptive passenger, or she sits here in increasing discomfort until the seatbelt sign goes off. Either outcome lets Brenda maintain control and punish her for speaking up earlier." Lena pressed her thighs together, trying to ignore the mounting pressure in her bladder. The turbulence Brenda had mentioned as justification for the seatbelt sign hadn't materialized yet. The plane flew smooth and steady at 35,000 feet, no bumps or jolts to suggest imminent danger. The sign was a pretext, a tool Brenda was wielding to enforce compliance and demonstrate power. The cockpit door opened and Brenda emerged, her expression set in lines of professional regret that looked practiced and insincere. She approached Lena's row with measured steps, drawing out the moment, making everyone wait for her pronouncement. "The captain has confirmed that seatbelt sign compliance is mandatory for all passengers without exception during periods of anticipated turbulence. You'll need to wait until the sign is turned off." Her delivery was perfect, sympathetic concern layered over absolute denial, as if she was simply the messenger of unavoidable policy rather than the architect of deliberate cruelty. "That's not what the captain said." A new voice cut through Brenda's performance, young and uncertain but determined. Marco Ellis, the junior flight attendant Lena had noticed during boarding, stood in the aisle near row 6 with his hands clenched at his sides. "I was in the galley when you spoke with Captain Torres. He said to use your discretion and that pregnancy accommodation takes precedence over non-emergency seatbelt protocols." The cabin went absolutely silent. Even the ambient noise of the engines seemed to fade as passengers absorbed what had just happened. A crew member had directly contradicted his superior's stated position, exposing her lie in front of 24 witnesses. It was the kind of workplace defiance that carried consequences, the kind of truth-telling that would cost Marco something significant, and he'd done it anyway. Brenda's face went through a rapid transformation, shock giving way to fury, giving way to a forced calm that looked fragile enough to shatter. "Marco, I need you to return to your station immediately. We'll discuss your interpretation of the captain's instructions after we land." "There's no interpretation needed." Marco's voice was shaking, but he held his ground. Captain Torres specifically said, and I quote, "Let the pregnant passenger use the lavatory if she needs to. We're not going to make someone that far along hold it because of light chop that might not even materialize." Those were his exact words. Brenda's composure fractured visibly, cracks spreading across the professional mask she'd maintained since boarding. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her breathing quickened, and when she spoke, the veneer of customer service had been stripped away entirely to reveal something raw and ugly underneath. "You are out of line, Ellis. Completely and utterly out of line. I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, which means cabin operations fall under my authority, not yours." If you continue to undermine my decisions in front of passengers, I will have you written up for insubordination the moment we touch down in Savannah. Write me up. Marco's voice gained strength from somewhere deep, the kind of courage that came from watching something wrong happen too many times and finally deciding the cost of silence was higher than the cost of speaking. Write me up for accurately reporting what the captain said. Write me up for knowing the regulations that are supposed to protect passengers. But don't pretend you're enforcing policy when you're just punishing someone for existing in a way that makes you uncomfortable. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or disperse. Several passengers pulled out phones, some recording, others texting, all of them documenting this moment when the careful pretense of professional service collapsed into open conflict. Lena sat frozen, simultaneously grateful for Marco's intervention and horrified that someone barely out of his 20s was risking his job to defend her bladder. I want to speak to a supervisor, Lena heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. Not after we land. Right now. Because what's happening here isn't about safety or regulations. It's about you deciding I don't deserve the same consideration as other passengers, and then hiding behind policy when you're called out on it. Brenda turned on her with the full force of her anger finally unleashed. You want to speak to a supervisor? Fine. I'll radio ground operations in Savannah right now and you can explain to them why you've been disruptive, argumentative, and non-compliant since the moment you boarded this aircraft. I'll explain how you've created multiple disturbances, refused to follow crew instructions, and enlisted other passengers to harass me while I'm trying to do my job. That's a complete fabrication. Catherine was on her feet now. Her earlier guilt about staying silent apparently transformed into fury at watching the gaslighting happen in real time. This woman has been nothing but polite despite being struck, denied equal service, charged for items other passengers received free, and now refused a medically necessary accommodation. You're not being harassed. You're being held accountable, and you can't handle it. Sit down immediately or I will have the captain turn this plane around and have you removed by law enforcement. Brenda's threat was delivered with the confidence of someone who'd used it before and watched it work, who understood that the fear of being labeled a problem passenger was usually enough to silence dissent. But Catherine didn't sit. Instead, she pulled a business card from her purse and held it up. Judge Catherine Reeves, Colorado 4th District Court. I've presided over enough discrimination cases to recognize a textbook pattern when I see one. And what I'm seeing right now is a flight attendant who has systematically targeted a pregnant passenger for mistreatment, then threatened witnesses who attempted to intervene. So no, I will not sit down. I will stand right here and ensure this interaction is witnessed and documented by as many people as possible. The revelation that one of the passengers was a sitting judge shifted the atmosphere in the cabin like air pressure changing before a storm. Brenda's face went pale beneath her makeup, the calculations happening behind her eyes visible in the rapid flickering of expressions she couldn't quite control. This had stopped being a manageable situation the moment Marco exposed her lie about the captain's instructions. It had escalated beyond salvage when a federal judge announced she was personally witnessing discriminatory conduct. I'm going to use the lavatory now. Lena unbuckled her seatbelt with hands that shook from adrenaline and the desperate need to urinate. Because my bladder doesn't care about your authority complex. And because Captain Torres apparently already gave permission that you chose to lie about. If you physically prevent me from accessing the facilities, that's assault. If you try to have me removed from this flight for exercising my legal rights as a pregnant passenger, that's retaliation for protected activity under federal law. She stood carefully, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward in the confined space. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, whether from sitting too long or from the surge of adrenaline flooding her system. She couldn't tell. But she remained upright, meeting Brenda's furious glare with a calm she absolutely did not feel. Brenda stepped into the aisle, physically blocking Lena's path to the lavatory. "I'm ordering you to return to your seat. And I'm ordering you to step aside." Judge Reeves's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Right now, what I'm witnessing could be construed as false imprisonment and denial of medical accommodation, both of which are federal offenses when they occur on an aircraft. So unless you want to add those charges to what is already going to be a very comprehensive complaint, I suggest you move." For a long moment, nobody breathed. The entire cabin watched two women face off in an aisle designed for one, engaged in a contest of wills that had stopped being about bathroom access and become about power, dignity, and the question of who deserved to be treated as human. Brenda broke first. She stepped aside with a movement so abrupt it looked like she'd been shoved, her face contorted with barely suppressed rage. "Fine. Use the lavatory. But when we land, you will be met by airline security and escorted off this aircraft pending an investigation into your disruptive behavior." "We'll all be met by airline security." Caleb held up his phone, screen showing the recording in progress. "Because I've captured approximately 12 minutes of footage showing systematic discrimination, false statements to passengers about captain's orders, physical blocking of medical accommodation, and threats of retaliation. I've also already uploaded it to cloud storage, so asking me to delete it won't accomplish anything except adding destruction of evidence to your growing list of problems." Lena moved past Brenda toward the lavatory, her body trembling with the aftermath of confrontation and the overwhelming relief of being allowed to address a basic biological need. As she closed the bathroom door behind her and finally relieved the pressure that had been building for the past 30 minutes, tears started streaming down her face. Not from sadness or even fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of having to fight this hard just to exist in a space she'd paid to occupy. She could hear raised voices through the thin bathroom door, couldn't make out words but could identify tones. Judge Reeves speaking with judicial authority. Marco's younger voice defending his position. Howard Chun citing regulations. And underneath it all, Brenda's increasingly shrill insistence that she was the victim here, that passengers were ganging up on her, that she'd done nothing wrong. When Lena emerged from the lavatory 3 minutes later, the scene in first class had transformed. Captain Torres himself had come out of the cockpit, a Latino man in his 50s with silver threading through his dark hair, and the weathered calm of someone who'd flown through actual emergencies rather than manufactured ones. He stood in the aisle speaking quietly with Brenda while Marco hovered nearby and Judge Reeves watched with the focused attention of someone preparing to write a legal opinion. Captain Torres looked up as Lena approached, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone trained to maintain calm during crisis. "Miss Corbett, I'm Captain Luis Torres. I apologize that you've experienced difficulties on this flight. I understand there's been some confusion about accommodation protocols." "There's been no confusion," Judge Reeves interjected before Lena could respond. "There's been deliberate obstruction of a pregnant passenger's legal rights, followed by false statements about your instructions, followed by threats of retaliation when witnesses challenged those false statements. I've documented the entire sequence of events and will be providing testimony to both the airline and the FAA." Torres absorbed this information with a slight tightening around his eyes, the only indication that he understood the magnitude of what was unfolding in his cabin. "I see." Miss Kroll, I'm gonna need you to return to the rear galley while I sort this out. Mr. Ellis, please take over first-class service for the remainder of the flight. You're removing me from my station based on the word of passengers who have been disruptive since boarding? Brenda's voice climbed higher, desperation creeping in around the edges of her anger. I've been with this airline for 18 years. I've never had a substantiated complaint. These people are lying to cover their own bad behavior. I watched you strike Ms. Corbett's hand during the seatbelt extender incident. Torres's voice remained level but carried unmistakable authority. I have a camera feed in the cockpit that provides limited visual of the first-class cabin. I saw the physical contact. I also heard you tell me over the intercom that Ms. Corbett had become aggressive and grabbed equipment from your hands, which is not what the video showed. The revelation that the cockpit had visual evidence seemed to drain something fundamental from Brenda's defiance. Her face went slack, her hands falling to her sides, her body language shifting from aggressive to defeated in the space of a single breath. I didn't know about the camera. Clearly, Torres gestured toward the rear of the aircraft. Galley. Now, we'll discuss this further on the ground. But for the immediate future, you're relieved of passenger-facing duties. Brenda moved down the aisle like someone walking through water, her movements slow and mechanical. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Passengers watched her pass with expressions ranging from satisfaction to pity to carefully maintained neutrality. When she disappeared behind the curtains separating first class from economy, a collective exhale seemed to move through the cabin. Torres turned his attention to Lena, his demeanor shifting from authoritative to genuinely concerned. Miss Corbett, are you injured? Do you need medical attention? Lena held up her hand, where the red marks from Brenda's slap had darkened into distinct bruises shaped like fingerprints. I'm not injured, but I am documenting everything that's happened. I have timestamps, witness statements, and video evidence of systematic discrimination. I don't doubt it. Torres pulled a small notebook from his pocket. I need to file an incident report that will be reviewed by our safety department, our legal team, and potentially the FAA depending on how Ms. Kroll's union chooses to respond. Can you give me a brief overview of the incidents you're planning to report? Lena pulled out her phone and read from her notes, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Physical contact during the seatbelt extender exchange. Denial of complimentary beverages and snacks provided to other passengers. False statements about my membership status to justify charging me for items that should have been free. Denial of lavatory access during a non-emergency seatbelt sign period despite pregnancy accommodation requirements. False representation of your instructions regarding that lavatory access. And threats of having me removed from the aircraft for asserting my legal rights. Torres wrote quickly, his pen moving across the page with practiced efficiency. And you have witnesses who can corroborate these incidents? Multiple witnesses. Judge Reeves spoke up. I'm prepared to provide sworn testimony. I'm also prepared to subpoena the cockpit camera footage you mentioned if Prairie Skies attempts to deny or minimize what occurred. I have video evidence of several incidents. Caleb held up his phone, already backed up to cloud storage with timestamps. Happy to provide copies to anyone who needs them. I can testify to the false statements about Captain's orders. Marco's voice was quieter than the others but no less firm. I heard the actual conversation and I heard what Ms. Kroll told passengers. They weren't the same. Torres closed his notebook and met Lena's eyes directly. Ms. Corbett, I want you to know that what happened to you today is not representative of Prairie Sky's values or training protocols. I understand that statement probably sounds hollow given your experience, but I need to say it anyway. What occurred in this cabin was unacceptable, and there will be consequences. What kind of consequences? Lena surprised herself with the directness of the question. Because I've heard a lot about airline employees facing consequences that turn out to be paid suspension or internal review processes that protect the employee rather than address the systemic problems that enabled the behavior in the first place. Torres was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much he could or should say. I can't discuss personnel matters or predict outcomes of investigations that haven't been completed yet. What I can tell you is that physical contact with a passenger outside of emergency safety situations is grounds for immediate termination under our contract. False statements to the captain about passenger behavior is also termination-level misconduct. The other issues you've documented will be investigated thoroughly. She'll claim it was all misunderstandings. Lena spoke from exhausted certainty rather than cynicism. She'll say the physical contact was accidental, that she was just trying to hand me the extender and I moved at the wrong time. She'll say the beverage and snack denials were computer errors. She'll say she misheard your instructions about the lavatory. And unless someone in authority is willing to call those explanations what they are, which is calculated lies, she'll face minimal consequences and be back on flights within a month. Not if I have anything to say about it. Judge Reeves pulled out her own phone. I'm emailing my preliminary observations to Prairie Sky's corporate counsel right now, with copies to the Department of Transportation's Aviation Consumer Protection Division and the Federal Aviation Administration's Civil Rights Office. I'm also noting that I observed a pattern of discriminatory conduct that suggests this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather an established practice that the airline has failed to address despite what I'm certain are previous complaints. She looked up from her phone to make eye contact with Torres. Captain, I respect that you're trying to handle this professionally, but I'm a federal judge who just watched a member of your crew commit what could reasonably be prosecuted as assault, false imprisonment, and civil rights violations. My responsibility isn't to Prairie Sky's reputation. It's to ensure this conduct is addressed through proper channels with appropriate severity. The plane touched down in Savannah 90 minutes later with the kind of smooth landing that suggested Captain Torres was very good at his job, even if his airline's hiring practices for cabin crew left much to be desired. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings with the usual rustle of overhead bins opening and carry-ons being retrieved. But in first class, nobody moved. They sat watching the jetway approach, waiting to see what consequences looked like at ground level. Torres's voice came over the intercom one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated after we reach the gate. There will be a brief delay before regular deplaning begins due to an administrative matter that requires resolution. Thank you for your patience and for flying Prairie Skies. Through the window, Lena could see airport security vehicles positioned near the gate, their lights casting red and blue shadows across the tarmac. A woman in a business suit stood on the jetway holding a tablet, her posture suggesting she was someone important who'd been called away from something else to deal with this situation. Behind her, two more people in Prairie Sky's uniforms waited with expressions that ranged from concern to grim. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Marco appeared from the rear galley, his face pale but determined, and opened the aircraft door. The woman with the tablet boarded immediately, followed by the two uniformed employees and airport security. She scanned the first-class cabin with sharp eyes that missed nothing, taking in the cluster of passengers in rows 3 and 4 who were clearly the epicenter of whatever incident had required her presence. I'm Diane Chun, Director of Customer Relations for Prairie Skies. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who solved problems for a living and wasn't particularly happy about the problem currently sitting in her aircraft. Captain Torres has briefed me on the situation. I need to speak with Ms. Lena Corbett, Judge Catherine Reeves, and any other passengers who witnessed the incidents in question. Lena raised her hand, feeling absurdly like a student in a classroom.
I'm Lena Corbett.
Diane's expression softened slightly when she saw Lena's pregnant belly. Miss Corbett, first let me apologize on behalf of Prairie Skies for your experience today. What you've described in the preliminary report is completely unacceptable and contrary to every policy we have regarding passenger treatment and disability accommodation. Pregnancy accommodation, Judge Reeves corrected. The Air Carrier Access Act specifically addresses pregnancy as a protected status. The violations weren't just company policy breaches, they were federal law violations. Noted. Diane made a mark on her tablet. Judge Reeves, I recognize you from the bench. Your preliminary email reached our legal department approximately 40 minutes ago and has already triggered a full investigation protocol. I need to inform you that Ms. Kroll has been suspended pending that investigation, effective immediately upon landing. She turned to address the security officers. Please escort Ms. Kroll from the aircraft. She's to leave through the crew entrance, not through the passenger terminal. Her credentials have been deactivated, and she's not to return to any Prairie Skies aircraft or facility until the investigation concludes. One of the officers moved toward the rear galley, returning moments later with Brenda, who looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past 2 hours. Her makeup was smeared from crying, her uniform rumpled, her carefully constructed authority completely dismantled. She didn't look at anyone as she was escorted past first class toward the crew exit, but Lena saw her shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs. Here's what most people don't know. For every Lena who had a captain step in, there are dozens who don't. Dozens of pregnant passengers denied bathroom access. Dozens of disabled travelers humiliated in silence. If this story is making you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is what change feels like. Hit that like button if you believe crew authority should never mean crew tyranny. Subscribe because these stories need witnesses who refuse to look away. Part of Lena felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. Brenda's career was over. Her reputation was destroyed. The video evidence would follow her through any attempt to work in service industries again. She'd built 18 years of employment on a foundation of selective cruelty, and it had collapsed in a single flight because she'd finally targeted someone whose mistreatment couldn't be ignored or minimized. But the pity was fleeting, burned away by the memory of being struck, denied, gaslit, and threatened. By the understanding that Brenda had done this to countless other passengers who hadn't had witnesses, video evidence, or a federal judge in the seat next to them. By the recognition that consequences weren't punishment, they were accountability for choices freely made. Diane waited until Brenda had been removed before continuing. Ms. Corbett, Prairie Skies would like to offer you full compensation for your ticket, an upgrade voucher for future travel, and enrollment in our premium customer care program as a gesture of our commitment to making this right. I don't want vouchers. Lena's voice was tired but clear. I want policy changes that ensure this doesn't happen to the next pregnant woman who boards one of your flights. I want training protocols that teach crew members that accommodation isn't a favor. It's a legal requirement. I want oversight mechanisms that catch patterns of discriminatory behavior before they escalate to physical contact and false imprisonment. She gestured to her fellow passengers. These people saved me today. Judge Reeves, Caleb Voss, Howard Chin, Marco Ellis. They spoke up when staying silent would have been easier and safer. But passengers shouldn't have to form coalitions to access basic dignity. The system should protect people by default, not require them to fight for rights that are already guaranteed by law. Diane was quiet for a long moment, her fingers moving across her tablet with swift efficiency. You're absolutely right. The system failed you. What I can offer you right now, in addition to compensation, is a direct line to me personally. My cell number, not a customer service line. Anytime you fly Prairie Skies in the future, you contact me 24 hours before departure, and I will personally ensure your accommodations are met and that the crew is briefed on proper protocols. That's reactive, not preventive. Judge Reeves stood up, her judicial bearing making her seem taller than her actual height. What Ms. Corbett is asking for is systemic change. What you're offering is a band-aid for one passenger. Prairie Skies needs to implement what I'm calling the Corbett Protocol. Mandatory pregnancy accommodation training for all crew members, independent passenger advocates in every hub airport, and a zero-tolerance policy for accommodation denial that includes immediate suspension and investigation. Diane met the judge's eyes steadily. Those are policy decisions above my authorization level. But I can commit to bringing your recommendations to our executive team with my strong endorsement. I can also commit to ensuring that the investigation into today's incidents is thorough, transparent, and results in concrete changes to our training and oversight procedures. I want it in writing. Lena stood up carefully, her body aching from hours of tension and stress. Not promises, documentation, a timeline for implementation, metrics for success, and public accountability for whether those changes actually happen. You'll have it within 72 hours. Diane extended her hand. I'm sorry this happened to you, Miss Corbett, and I'm grateful you had the courage to document it and demand accountability. Most passengers would have just accepted the mistreatment and never flown with us again. Your willingness to fight for change will benefit thousands of travelers who come after you. Lena shook her hand, feeling the weight of 9 months settling into her bones. All she wanted now was to see her sister Simone, to sleep in a bed that didn't vibrate with engine noise, to process everything that had happened without having to perform strength for an audience. But she also understood that this moment mattered, that what happened next would determine whether today's trauma became tomorrow's reform. Caleb stepped forward, his phone already queued to the cloud folder where he'd stored all his footage. I'm sending the video evidence to Ms. Corbett and to Judge Reeves. I'm also posting a redacted version to social media with #JusticeAt35,000. Public pressure tends to accelerate institutional change in ways that private complaints don't. I would ask that you delay that posting for 24 hours. Diane's request was careful, professional. Not to suppress the evidence, but to allow our team to get ahead of the narrative with our own statement acknowledging the incident and our response. If this breaks on social media before we've issued a formal response, it looks like we're reacting to public pressure rather than addressing legitimate complaints through proper channels. Respectfully, that's exactly what you're doing. Howard Chun had remained quiet through most of the post-flight discussion, but now he spoke with the measured precision of an engineer who'd calculated the angles and found them wanting. You're addressing this because it became impossible to ignore, because a judge witnessed it, because video evidence exists, because the passenger had the resources and support to fight back. If Lena had been traveling alone, if she hadn't had allies, if Brenda's lies about her behavior had gone unchallenged, this conversation wouldn't be happening. He pulled out his own business card and handed it to Diane. I consult on safety protocols for 3 major airlines. None of them are your competitors, so there's no conflict of interest. But I'm offering my services pro bono to help Prairie Skies develop the training and oversight mechanisms Judge Reeves outlined. Not because I think you'll do the right thing out of moral conviction, but because I think you'll do it to avoid the next viral video showing your crew assaulting a pregnant passenger. Diane accepted the card without comment, her professional composure intact but something shifting behind her eyes that might have been respect or resignation or both. I'll pass your information to our operations director. Thank you for the offer. She turned back to the assembled passengers. You're all free to deplane now. There will be no charges, no airline-imposed consequences, no retaliation of any kind for your involvement in documenting and reporting this incident. If anyone experiences any form of blowback, I want to hear about it immediately. The passengers gathered their belongings and filed off the aircraft one by one, each of them stopping to shake Lena's hand or offer words of support. Marco was the last to approach, his young face still showing traces of the fear he'd pushed through to tell the truth. Thank you for speaking up. Lena squeezed his hand gently. You risked your job to defend a stranger. That took real courage. I should have done it sooner. His voice cracked slightly. I've seen her treat passengers like that before. I told myself it wasn't my place to challenge a senior crew member, that I was too new to understand all the context. But watching her hit you, and then lie about it, I realized that staying quiet was just protecting her ability to keep hurting people. You did the right thing when it mattered most. Judge Reeves handed him her card. If Prairie Skies attempts to retaliate against you in any way, I want to know immediately. Whistleblower protections exist for a reason, and I'll make sure they're enforced if necessary. Marco nodded, pocketing the card, and headed toward the crew exit with shoulders that seemed a little straighter than they'd been when he boarded that morning. Lena watched him go and felt something settle in her chest that might have been hope or vindication, or simply the recognition that systems only changed when individuals decided the cost of maintaining them was higher than the cost of dismantling them. She stepped off the aircraft into the jetway and saw her sister Simone waiting at the gate, her own pregnant belly only slightly smaller than Lena's, her face showing the worry that came from receiving cryptic text messages about issues with the flight crew. Lena walked into her sister's arms and finally let herself cry. Not from sadness or fear or even relief, but from the sheer exhaustion of having survived something that should never have required survival. What happened? Simone's voice was gentle, concerned, the voice of someone who knew her sister well enough to recognize when tears meant trauma rather than simple emotion. I'll tell you everything. Lena pulled back, wiping her face with the back of her hand. But first, I need to use an actual bathroom with a door that locks and nobody timing how long I'm in there. And then I need food that nobody's gonna charge me $3 for. And then I need to hold my nephew and remember that sometimes the world is good. They walked through Savannah International Airport arm in arm, two pregnant sisters navigating a space that suddenly felt safer than it had 2 hours ago at 35,000 feet. Behind them, in the aircraft they just left, Diane Chun was already on her phone with corporate counsel, beginning the process of transforming one woman's documented trauma into policy changes that would protect thousands of travelers who would never know Lena Corbett's name but would benefit from her refusal to accept injustice quietly. And in a hotel room in Denver where she'd been ordered to wait for the investigation, Brenda Kroll sat staring at her deactivated employee badge, finally understanding that 18 years of small cruelties had caught up with her in a single flight. That video evidence didn't care about her intentions. That witnesses couldn't be gaslit when they'd formed a coalition. that the passengers she dismissed as powerless had possessed the most important power of all, the willingness to tell the truth even when silence would have been easier. The sky hadn't changed that day, but the people in it had. And that, Lena thought as she felt her son kick against her ribs, in what might have been celebration or protest or simply acknowledgement of the turbulence they'd weathered together, was exactly how transformation happened. One documented incident at a time. One witness willing to speak at a time. One person refusing to shrink at a time. Justice didn't land softly with apologies and vouchers. It took off on the wings of people who decided that dignity wasn't negotiable, that accommodation wasn't a favor, and that silence in the face of cruelty made you complicit in its continuation. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to change not just a flight, but an entire system built on the assumption that some people's comfort mattered more than other people's humanity.